This is John Malloy, the director of the Centre for Public Ethics at Martin Luther University College in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. On January 24, 2020, we were pleased to welcome Kathleen Wynne, Ontario's 25th Premier to Luther, to speak about the role of faith in public life. What follows is a recording of her talk, including a question and answer session with the audience.
It's a real pleasure to be here, and I appreciate you coming out this morning, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. First, let me thank John. As John said, we were colleagues at Queen's Park. We were elected together in 2003, and we spent a lot of time, first as backbenchers, trying to sort out our role and trying to work within government to raise the issues that were important to us to the forefront. And I will just say, John was one of the charter members of the Women's Caucus of the Liberal government under Dalton McGuinty. And what that meant was that John spent a lot of time with people like Deb Matthews and me and Monique Smith, having conversations about how we raise up issues like poverty to the agenda, because we didn't run in 2003 on an agenda that was about poverty reduction. So I will come back to that, but it was always a pleasure to work with John. And in fact, when he decided not to run again, my dad at the time said, "What are you going to do without John?" Because he was our house leader, and Dad loved it when John would stand up because he was so calm. So you were missed, and it's a pleasure to be here with you, John. Thank you. And to all of the leadership of the university, thank you very much for welcoming me. So I'm here to have this conversation with you about my own perspective on this topic of faith and politics, religion and politics. I think they are related, but not exactly the same. But just know that I am not a student of religion. That is not my background. It is not what I have done. I am not a theologian. I am not in any way qualified to have that kind of discussion. But I am someone who was raised in the church, and I have been a politician, and I will be honest with you that it really was through conversations since I've been in elected office, and many of them with John, that I started to think in a sort of explicit way about how my faith had anything to do with or was related to my positions, the positions that I had taken in politics. And I suspect that this conversation is going to be challenging, but it's going to be easier than the one that I'm having this afternoon, which is going to be about Hydro One. So I'm going to enjoy this morning. And I don't know, maybe I'll bring the faith discussion into the discussion around Hydro One. So I just wanted to start by just posing the question as to why this conversation is so important at this time. I would suggest that this conversation is becoming increasingly more important as we look at what's happening in the political narrative here, in the United States, in Europe, really around the globe. Why is it important that we even have this discussion? And I think there are a couple of reasons that it's important. The first one for me is that I have come to believe that religion, and I'm going to use the word religion because it is the church, organized religion, is used as a hammer in conversations, as a partisan tool in many, many cases. And I think we can all agree there have been many travesties that have happened in the name of religion. But I think right now we're seeing religion and the gospel and faith of all kinds being used to make partisan arguments or to stake partisan positions. And I'll just say that the sex ed curriculum in Ontario is a perfect example of that, where the people who I met through that discussion, which started in 2010 and continued, I would suggest, right through to the present day, because it still gets called up as a blight on my government and on liberalism. The invocation of religion and of the language of the Bible or the language of Islam or Judaism, any of those arguments that were made, I think were an abuse of religious texts. And so for me, I think it's really important that we have an honest discussion about what we mean by faith and religion and how that actually works, and how our faith guides us, doesn't guide us, how it fits with our decisions as politicians. So I think that is a really important reason that we have this discussion now. I also think the second reason I think it's important is that it's almost the flip side of that, which is that I think that there can be a fear among politicians to be honest about what guides them, where they got their moral code, how they think about the decisions that they make, and where their guidance comes from. And I think in the last federal election, you know, the whole debate with Andrew Scheer about his conservative values and what they meant and what his belief system was. Personally, and this is speaking as a politician, I think where he got into trouble was he didn't just say, this is what I believe, this is how I was raised, this is my belief system, but this is what I'm going to do. End of story, and move on. I think he dissembled. I think he couldn't find his way through the conversation, and I think it made it more difficult for people to accept that he was being authentic. But what that does is it starts to foment this idea that, well, we can't talk about religion. And you know, the old tenets about religion and politics are the things you can't talk about at the dinner table, and you certainly can't talk about them together. I think is a real problem. So on the one hand, it's the rising of the use of religion as a hammer against progressive views, and the other is the silencing of the whole discussion. And so I think both of those things are dangerous. So that's why I think it's really important that we own who we are and that we have those conversations. So I'll just talk a little bit about my early contact, the way I was raised, and why this is even a discussion that I want to have. Some of you have read some of the interviews that I've done with the United Church Observer, which is now called Broadview. I was raised in the United Church. Richmond Hill United Church is where I grew up, and my family was United Church, although my mother had been raised in Nassau, Bahamas, and she was raised Catholic and Anglican. Her father was Catholic, Irish, and her family was English Anglican. So she went to those churches, and then she came into the United Church as when we were kids. But my paternal grandparents were very much rooted in the United Church. They came from southwestern Ontario. They came from Watford via Glasgow, and my great-great-grandfather, just a quick funny story, he was Presbyterian, and as you know, the United Church was formed of amalgamation of Methodists and Congregationalists and Presbyterians. And in 1925, when the union meeting happened at Mutual Street Arena in Toronto, he went to that meeting. He came from Adelaide, where he lived, and went to Mutual Street and went to the meeting. He was in his 90s at that point. He lived to be 105, so he was still really sharp. But apparently not sharp enough, because he came home from the meeting to my grandmother's house, his granddaughter, and he said to her, "Evie, I think I stood up at the wrong time," because he stood up and voted for union when he had meant to vote against union. So he was a continuing Presbyterian, which he hated that continuing Presbyterian label, but So that's who they were. They were Presbyterians. They were teetotal. They were very much community people. My grandmother would talk about going to church, and I'm convinced that the reason she loved church was because that's where the boys were. You know, that's where the social environment was. She lived in this little town of Adelaide, went to school in Watford, but there wasn't a lot going on, and so for her the church was very, very important. But she stayed in the church. My uncle played the organ at St. George's United in Toronto, and so I grew up with this understanding of the United Church. And for me, an early understanding of the United Church was that it was about community involvement. It was about finding ways to be with people, create community. It was less about the dogmatic parts of the religion. It was more about how do we create an environment where people have what they need. My grandmother was part of the United Church Women early on, and she was involved in campaigns to send money to Norman Bethune in China, and those were the kinds of conversations that we had. And then in the 60s, when everything was in turmoil, we were all members of the United Church in Richmond Hill, my mom and my dad, and their 4 girls. And a really disruptive thing happened, and that was that a radical minister came to town. His name was Harry Mackay, and he took the robes off, and he walked into the congregation, and he asked people to talk to him, and there was a sense of, something's going to happen here, because we're being asked, he was asking us in this comfortable pew in Richmond Hill to walk our talk and to be more involved and to speak out and to change the norms of this middle class, quiet church in the suburb of Toronto. And what happened through that process was the church split. Richmond Hill United split, in fact. There were about 25 families who left because he was basically drummed out of the church. He was removed by the presbytery, and my parents were one of that group, and they created a house church that for 5 years met every Friday night in various people's homes. And so I was part of the church at the time. Obviously, I was in my early teens. I was part of CGIT and part of the youth groups. And for whatever reason, I stayed in the church. My parents left, and I stayed. And I go back to that moment, and I wonder why I did, because I understood what my parents were doing, and I was proud of them for doing what they were doing, because I thought that Harry Mackay and his family had been dealt with very badly. But at the same time, I loved the community of the church. I loved being there, and I loved the camaraderie of my peer group, and it fed something in me, and it helped me to feel like I was part of the community in a different way. And so I carried this kind of contradictory reality for a few years in my teens, but I ultimately stayed in the church, and it was important to me. There was that gap in years when I got married and I had my kids, and then I came back to the church when my kids were little. And I'll be honest, I was looking for that same kind of camaraderie, that same kind of community. And I remember when I moved into North Toronto in 1981, and I spoke with the minister there. His name was Frank Meadows, and I said to him, I want to come back to the church. I had actually been christened but I'd never been confirmed, because my confirmation would have happened just around the time that the whole turmoil was happening with my parents. And so that's one of the things that didn't happen. I didn't get confirmed. But when we were getting my kids christened, I decided I would be confirmed. And Frank Meadows said to me, because I said to him, I have a lot of doubts. I have a lot of questions about what is said from the pulpit and what our belief system is, and when we stand up and say the creed, I'm not always sure that I can be completely completely authentic in saying those words. And he said, and this is what drew me in, he said, we need those doubters. We need doubters. That's exactly who we need in the church. And so that kept me in the United Church and has done throughout my time. So I went back when my kids were little and stayed right through. So that's kind of the short version of my background in the church. And I got very involved in the run-up to my taking on the challenges of being in political life. I got very involved in the politics of our own church and was, served on many committees. And you all know the politics of the church can be just as interesting as the politics of the non-church. So I gained a lot from that community. So then when I ran for office, it was because I believed in publicly funded education. So what's that got to do with what I've been talking about? I believe that government is the mechanism by which we do the things for each other that we can't do by ourselves. That's what government is. And so from my perspective, the reason to get involved in politics was to try to find a way to do things better so that people would be better off. And the specific issue for me was education. And it was in the Harris years that I really got involved. And I was very, very worried about the upheaval in our education system, the upheaval in our social institutions, which had, from my perspective, been built over decades with a mission to do the things that I thought we had a consensus on in Ontario, which was to have strong publicly funded health, to have an education system that would continue to be improved and continue to be more inclusive, and that we would continue to try to find ways to make sure that the playing field was as level as possible. I mean, I know, and we all know that there's unfairness, there's inherent unfairness, but I always thought that what we were about as a society was trying to improve people's lot, trying to share what is such a wealthy province, trying to share the benefits of living in this place. And I felt when Harris was elected and the rules started to change, I felt that social contract was broken. And that was what motivated me to get involved in provincial politics. Otherwise, I might never have done that. I mean, kids ask me, did I dream about being the premier? No, I didn't. I was working part-time in North Toronto. I had 3 little kids. It was not on my life plan to either be an MPP, certainly not to be the premier. It just had not crossed my mind. But getting involved in the political action seemed a logical thing for me to do, given what I believed about this province and what I believed about what the government existed to do. So that's why I ran for office. And John took that quote from what I said to the interviewer some months ago, that it's hard to separate my motivation to be in politics from my belief about why I'm on the planet. When people first started asking me this question, when I started to have this explicit conversation about faith and politics, I really did have to, as John said about the other person he was talking to, I had to stop and think about it, because it was such a seamless progression for me. Because the church, the United Church that I had grown up in, had opinions about things. The United Church, we were supposed to talk about social issues. We were supposed to talk about political action. And where my family specifically, but I as well, got impatient with our church was when we weren't talking about those things. We felt that we were supposed to be pushing the envelope and questioning and asking uncomfortable questions of the people who were making decisions. And so when it came time for me to decide whether I was going to protest a government that was undermining publicly funded education, taking money out of the hands of people who really needed it so they could feed their families, it did not feel like a leap to me at all. It felt like absolutely the only thing that it would be right to do. And so then when the question was asked, well, what about faith and politics? Well, they're seamless for me. There isn't a division. And so when I was asked, when I was running for the leadership in 2012 by Martin Reg Cohen, how did I want to be remembered? Which is a ridiculous thing to ask a politician because you have no control. I just want someone to like me at the end of my political career. That's all I really want. But what came out of me at that moment was I would love to be remembered as a social justice premier. That's why I'm in this. It's the only reason for me to do this because honestly, it's not that easy a job and many days it's not that much fun. And so to do it, you have to believe that you can make a difference. And for me, the making a difference was about kids who are not given the advantages that they need when they are born, and they are born into situations where they really need support. It's about young families who are struggling. It's about people who lose their way because of mental health issues or a whole myriad of other things. Or it's because we need to have institutions that recognize the needs of people in our community. For me, those were the reasons to be in politics. And so social justice premier that became an organizing idea for me around my time as premier. So then, when I think about the policies, both the economic and social policies, and I just want to stop there for a second because one of the things that I have talked a lot about in the last 5 or 6 years, and even more so as part of a group of women who have been premiers across the country, is this notion of what's a women's issue and what's a social issue and what's an economic issue, and do we talk about one first and then we talk about the others, and if we talk about the economy, how do we talk about childcare? And I just reject the notion that those things are separate. I even reject the notion that transit, and I look at Ken Sealing because we've had many conversations about transit. I reject the notion that transit is an economic issue as opposed to a social issue. We live in a world that has economic realities. And those economic realities for some people are they wake up in the morning and they can't get to where they need to get to because they can't afford a car, or there is no transit, or they can't afford a cab, or they can't find childcare. Those are economic realities. But they are also social realities. And so, from my perspective, dividing that policy pie and saying, we're going to talk about the economy, and then when we have time, we'll talk about poverty reduction and we'll talk about childcare, is nonsense. That's a nonsensical way of approaching public policy, in my opinion. Because if you have people who can't feed their families, or they can't get to work, or they can't even apply for a job because they can't buy a suit of clothes, then they are not able to participate in the economy in the way that they should be, and we lose. We all lose. And so when I was first the premier and we were putting together our first budget, we were in a pretty significant deficit in terms of the finances of this province. We were just climbing out of the economic downturn from 2008, 2009. But one of the decisions we made was to put more money explicitly in that budget for early childhood educators, developmental support workers, and personal support workers. Because we looked at Deb Matthews and Liz Sandals and I and John, we looked at the trajectory of salaries that had been paid, increases that had been paid to people like police officers and firefighters and the male-dominated professions, and we saw a trajectory that went up. And we looked at those female-dominated professions, and the trajectory was flat. They had not been getting increases. So I just use that as an example of, we're putting together a budget, we're in a deficit position, but we made a decision that we were going to attend to some of those issues that had been neglected, because I saw, and we saw, our cabinet saw those as part of the economic reality, which was the social reality of people living in this province. And so, whether it's transit, whether it's the basic income pilot, which we put in place, whether it was increases to legal aid or rent control or minimum wage or economic development in parts of the province that needed support, the North, for example, all of those things, all of those decisions were made for me using that set of guiding principles that I had built over the years, having started as a kid growing up in the United Church. And so there's the seamlessness for me, that the decision-making process for me began with, well, how do we find a way to improve the social fabric in this province, because that's why government exists, and then now talk to me about the budget issues that we have to tackle. So when I'm talking about faith in politics, I'm talking about my moral code, of course, I am. And I'm talking about the faith that I have in community, because my particular belief system is that it is the connection between human beings that creates that faith community. That's what I believe. That's how I've experienced it. I don't know about the guy sitting on the cloud. I just don't know about him or her or that spirit. I don't know. Those are where my doubts are. But I have no doubt, I have absolutely no doubt about the inherent goodness of people and the ability for a church community, a religious community, to tap into that if there's an intentionality about it. So all the decisions that I made with my colleagues were rooted in that belief system. So yes, it was about my moral code, but it was also about my political decision making, and the two were inextricably linked for me. I'm going to stop because I want to have a conversation with you, but I'll just end by saying that the church, and so when people talk to me about faith and religion, the church is not organized religion to me. It is that spiritual connection that we foster through faith, and that I carry wherever I go. That I take into every meeting that I am in, and that has been, when I'm asked about this question, that is the thing I am not afraid ever to talk about. And that is the thing that when I hear hatefulness, and when I had all the vile things said about me because I was a lesbian, because I was bringing in a change in curriculum, because I was doing the things that I was doing, that never got shaken. That faith in the importance of improving that social fabric, that never ever got shaken. But it did make me, when all that stuff was coming at me and at us, it did make me question how religion is being used in our world, and what we as people who believe that we're actually talking about a force for good, how do we counteract that? How do we deal with the hatred and the division that is being fostered in the name of religion? So I'm going to stop there, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thank you so much.
Hi, Kathleen.
Hi.
What's front and center stage now in politics, right from municipal to international, is the environment.
Yes.
And I certainly see that it's a part of the whole social construct. Like it's imperative that we do something about it for the sake of everyone. what do you see as the ties? I know you said organized religion is not what drives you, and it's the same for myself too. It's all about the moral upbringing and that sort of thing that we bring into it. But where does faith tie into this social imperative? Like what might be the links between those two?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And actually, I realized I look at my notes. Climate change was one of the things that we tackled early on, and I see it in very much the same terms as I see those other issues. That it is. Well, it's even more important than some of those other things, because without dealing with that, the others kind of become moot. Right now, I think one of the ways in which faith is going to have to carry us through is that we have to keep believing that there is a way for people to come together to solve this problem. Because it's very scary, and I worry about the anxiety that young people have to deal with, because it's their futures. I'm 66. This is a problem that my generation has helped to create, and we haven't found the solution. So for me, the faith component there is that we have the ability to do this. That if we keep moving forward and we keep pulling people in, and we support people like Greta Thunberg, and we don't listen to the haters who are attacking a kid like that we can actually get there. But it is truly a leap of faith to actually believe that we can do it. I don't think it's impossible, but it's a really important challenge. So I think it's a deeply important thing for our world and our economy, but it's also, if you believe that you find some of that faith grounding in nature or in the beauty of the world, which is one of the things that when I'm on a canoe trip, I feel like I'm closer to whatever that being is than anywhere else. How can we not try to save the planet? So that for me is kind of what keeps me going on that front.
Right. Yeah, thank you for that. And would you say the infrastructure that's in place because of organized religion, does that have any role to play? Can we leverage the worldwide systems of religions that we have in place to tackle this?
I think we should be able to. We have to stop fighting about bricks and mortar. There are more conversations about the roof and the number of seats in the bums in the seats in churches than certainly in the denomination that I belong to. We have to move away from those conversations and use the human infrastructure. I think we get caught up in the physical infrastructure a lot of the time. But yes, I think we should be able to use the organizing tool that organized religion, whatever the denomination, whatever the faith group, we should be able to use that to bring people together, because we should be able to build a consensus. I say should because I don't know. There's a lot of division, obviously, and that very extreme versions of some of our faiths, in my opinion, get in the way of just what you're talking about, actually being able to use the organizing ability of our faith. But yeah, we should be able to.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, Kathleen.
Hi.
I'm David Frimmer. I'm retired faculty from Luther College here. First of all, I just want to say how impressed I was. I remember marching, some of you were at that event in Ottawa when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its report. Thousands of people marched from Hull to Parliament Hill. I was walking down the street, and I saw this police officer, and I thought, this is odd, in uniform. And I looked over, and there you were, marching very unassumingly as a person of faith with this crowd of people, thousands of people. And I thought, boy, what a refreshing thing to see a political leader whose moral compass meant that they would come out to an event like that. So I certainly applaud you for that, and it was a great memory for me. Which builds on the question I want to ask, the second question, or the second part of my question, which is, as a political leader and as a person of faith, do you have examples of how the religious institutions, the formal faith communities, religious leaders, whoever, were helpful to the political process for you in your office, now as a politician, not as a person of faith. I'm not talking about pastoral visits and things like this, but what I'm saying is, when did churches and synagogues and religious communities make a helpful contribution? Do you have some examples that you could share with us about that sort of intervention?
So the two that I want to use. One is, when I was the Minister of Education, we were having challenging discussions about some of the policies that we were bringing in. It was in the development of the new health and physical education curriculum. So this goes back to 2010. And the bishop at the time, I guess it was the bishop. Was the bishop in Toronto? He's the cardinal now. He was the bishop then. Do I have to call him the cardinal? I don't. Okay. Anyway, the bishop at the time was he was pretty agitated about some of the things that were happening. But he came in and he sat down with me as the Minister of Education, and my chief of staff at the time was a member of the Catholic Church, and he was well connected, and he helped me have this conversation with the bishop, and it was a helpful conversation because we were able to not change positions on anything, but to have a discussion about how we could write the curriculum, how we could work with the Catholic education system to make sure that kids in Catholic schools were getting the information that they needed, and that what we were trying to do as a government was not antithetical to the Catholic faith. So that was a really helpful conversation. The other group of people who regularly interacted with us at Queen's Park was the ISARC group, so the interfaith social justice folks who would come regularly, and I met with them as recently as a couple of months ago. They come to Queen's Park, they would hold seminars, they would talk to us about poverty reduction, and they actually advised us as we were developing the basic income pilot and making changes to social assistance. And people like John were very connected to those faith leaders, and the only thing I would say to them when they would come regularly is, we need your voices even more. We need you to be really involved at the local level and to be speaking up. But I was always so grateful that they kept coming, and they do keep coming, and it's very, very important. So those are two examples.
Thank you.
Can I just I just want to pick up on something, because I thought what you were going to ask actually was an example where the church had done damage in a policy area, and there are some of those, but one of the areas, and this is something that has been something that hasn't been talked about a lot, but in our work with Indigenous communities, and I started my journey in relationship with Indigenous people in 1978. I spent a summer on a reserve as a volunteer with the Department of Indian Affairs, and I was writing a master's thesis at the time, writing the dialect of English that was spoken by the kids on that reserve, and what happened to them when they went from the reserve to school, and the expectations of the teachers, how the expectations of the teachers were lower for those kids because they spoke a dialect of English that was colored by Ojibwe and Cree. So throughout my political career, I tried to do what I could to improve the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people and the lot of particularly Indigenous kids. Anyway, one of the things that struck me when I was Minister of Education, then I was Minister of Aboriginal Affairs, and then when I was Premier, was that the role of the church through the residential schools, but way beyond the residential schools, in our history of Indigenous peoples in this country is a shameful one, and it goes on. The damage continues, and I think that there are many congregations, many faith groups that have taken that up and have acknowledged that, but I think it's something that it's a story that has not been told completely even yet. So I will stop there.
Thank you for being with us. My name is Henriette Thompson.
Hi, Henriette.
And For the years of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission mandate, I served as the Anglican Church of Canada lead and worked closely with the United Church, the Roman Catholic entities, and the Presbyterian Church to work closely with the TRC.
Oh, so important, yeah.
It was an honor. My question follows up on what you've just said, and that is that I think as time goes on, the work in the climate crisis movement is more and more integrated with the work for Indigenous self-determination and rights. And to my mind, it becomes more and more critical to look at the relationships that were established at Confederation and also presented in the treaties of 1763 and 1764, the Royal Proclamation, and then the Treaty of Niagara. So my question is, were there any takeaways or insights that stayed with you, for example, with respect to Grassy Narrows, with Anishinaabe Nation, with a lot of the issues in Ontario concerning land claims and Indigenous rights to self-determination, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as it's spelled out there? Because I think going forward, what I hear Indigenous people saying is that we really have to look at a whole new set of relationships. The system doesn't work.
Right. Yeah. So I have spent a lot of time thinking about this. I've spent a lot of time trying to grapple with these issues. I have been to Grassy Narrows. I've been to many reserves around the province, up to the farthest north, which is Fort Severn, and I have really tried to find ways to have conversations and then move to action that will help in all of those situations. And there are a couple of takeaways. One is that we have to be much better. We as government have to be much better about listening to the governments of the First Nation and Métis people, because they are government-to-government relationships. We have to listen better. And we have to listen better, and then we have to find ways to act together. And that takes time. It takes more time, quite frankly, than white people want to spend. And that is just a reality, but it's an important one for us to acknowledge and to just get over ourselves. That is my opinion about that piece. So that's one takeaway. And we have to be persistent. You know, we have to not walk away when it feels like it's falling apart, because there will be many moments when it feels like it's falling apart, but we can't afford to walk away. And so I can tell you the Grassy Narrows situation is a very painful one for me, because the way it gets reported, the way it gets talked about, there's a real gap between the work that we tried to do and what's actually happening. But you can't get defensive and shut down about that. You have to keep going. So that's the first one. The second one is that often the conversations that I have been involved in with Indigenous people divide into two categories. There's a jurisdictional rights-based conversation that has to do with how do we honor treaties and how do we together disentangle our interdependence or our power dynamic. How do we do that, and how do we move forward in a way that is consistent with that original relationship? How do we do that? And the second conversation the other conversation is, how do we make sure kids have water to drink, that they can go to school, that moms can get help when they're having a baby, that people who have diabetes actually get the service. And those should not be mutually exclusive conversations, but sometimes they are. Sometimes we have a situation where, well, I'm not going to talk to you about this about those children and those needs until we sort all this out. Well, I'm telling you, this conversation about jurisdiction and rights is going to take longer than any of our lifetimes, including the young people in the room, because it is a very, very deeply divisive and difficult conversation. And it is one we have to engage, and we have to be there, and we have to have it. And we have made some progress. You know, there are examples in this province where there's self-government on education. The Union of Ontario Indians, the UOI, worked with us and worked with the federal government. There's a self-governing entity in education because of the work that we did. So there can be progress. But we cannot leave this part. We cannot leave the practical, human pain aside while we have this discussion. And my experience was that often this was a male-female division. Often it was, and this is not universal, but I'm going to make a generalization, often it was male leadership that got caught here, and there was female leadership, and quite honestly, there weren't often a lot of women around the table, and they were pushing for, okay, fine, can we do this simultaneously? Can we have these discussions simultaneously? It's why Trudeau created 2 different ministries, to try to have a parallel track, but we've got to find ways to have both conversations at once. So when I was in meetings with the Matawa First Nations, there are 9 First Nations that are the communities around the Ring of Fire area, that chromite and mineral deposit in Northern Ontario. We came to an agreement in principle, but we could not agree on moving ahead to build the road. It's the practical side, which would lead to economic development and social security for those First Nations. We couldn't get to that conversation with all 9 First Nations because we were stuck on some of the jurisdictional issues. And so we tried to have a parallel process, and we ended up only moving ahead with 3 of the First Nations on the road. So that's just an example of, and that was a 2-year process, to my first point. It was 2 years. I sat as Premier with David Zimmer, my minister, sat with the chiefs of those 9 First Nations to try to find a way. For me, the issue was not getting the chromite out of the ground. It was about getting roads built so that we could deal with the fact that the ice roads, the winter roads, are melting more quickly, and we need infrastructure in order for those communities to be able to survive. So the second important takeaway was that we got to do all of it. We've got to do curriculum, we've got to do water, we've got to do jurisdiction, we've got to do it all at once. But please, let's not get stuck on the treaty and jurisdiction discussion without recognizing we have to do this other piece. Sorry, that's a long answer, but it's a big issue. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
My name's Kayla. I'm a master's student here. So I'm also a lesbian. I was raised in the United Church. So a lot of what you were saying I could kind of resonate with, especially what you were talking about in terms of community and how sometimes it's more understanding yourself in community as opposed to understanding yourself in faith, and how those lines are often blurred.
Right.
What's interesting too is my research focus is on the influence that religion and culture have on identity formation and feelings of belonging in LGBTQ+ refugees in Canada. So I guess my question for you is, how do you reconcile queer identity in the church, particularly considering the ways in which organized religion is being used as a partisan hammer, as you said before?
So your question is, how do I reconcile?
Yeah, what does that mean to you?
What
How
does
do
it
you kind
mean?
of
Yeah.
sit? Because I think for a lot of us who kind of sit in this in-between, in this gray area,
Yeah.
there's a lot of kind of push and pull and trying to figure out, what identity fits where and
Yeah.
how to kind of spread yourself.
Yeah, so I try not to divide the identities. I try to integrate them to the greatest degree possible. And I'll be honest. When I came out, so I was 37 when I came out in my community, and the church was one of the places. The United Church was one of the places that helped Jane and me get through it. even though there were people who were way more worried about my husband. What's going to happen to Phil than they were about us. We were like, Phil's fine. He's fine. He's going to be fine. But there was, it was a time when there were people leaving the church because of this issue. But I have found that the vast majority of people, once they're given permission to grapple with these issues, once they're given a human face for the issue, it becomes less of an issue. And so I think it's important for us to show up. I guess that's my perspective, is that the way I have dealt with it is by being there and is by not going away. And I had the privilege of having lived for 37 years with white heterosexual privilege, and then when I came out, I had already been a member of the Mission and Personnel Committee. I had already been a member of the executive committee at the church, and so it was really hard for people to reject me because they knew me, And so I think the better we can be known and be part of the community and be who we are, the better it is for everybody. That's how I've managed it.
All right, thank you.
And when you asked that question, for some reason I went to thinking about all of the faith communities that I have spent time in. One of the privileges that we have as politicians is that we're invited everywhere. And it has been my experience that at a human level, whether it's a Hindu temple or whether it's Jamaat Khana or whether it's a mosque or whether it is a synagogue, wherever I've been, it has been a warm, welcoming, human environment. Yes, there have been people who have been uncomfortable, for sure, but it's always been a nurturing place to be. That's been my personal experience.
All right, thank you.
Hi there, Ms. Wynne.
Hi.
I appreciated listening to your conversation around your faith and how that influenced your desire to make a positive impact in the social reality that we live in. My name is Eugene Verstegen. I work for Christian Horizons, and we are an organization that supports people with a developmental disability in Ontario and in Saskatchewan and in 6 developing nations around the world. And so, I want to thank you and John Malloy for some of the work that you did in your leadership throughout the deinstitutionalization in 2009, your apology to people with developmental disabilities in 2013 for having lived in institutions for so long, the investments that you made into developmental services that you acknowledged today, which were amazing, recognizing that under pressure that we were with the financial reality that we had, that people who are supporting people with developmental disabilities were still undervalued. Mm-hmm. Christian Horizons over the years has gone through a significant transformation in trying to move from sort of a right to exist as a faith-based organization to really describing what is our reason to exist and how do we help to both help the Christian community as well as the broad community to understand the value of all people with a developmental disability, that people are created in the image of God and that we can see people as fully belonging in community. I guess my question kind of is, or maybe you have comments around, as a Christian organization, we still at times find it not an awkward spot, but really trying to help both the Christian community and the broad public community understand the value of a faith-based organization, having influence in the public sector, in public value add. And so I just wondered if you had any sort of comments around a faith-based organization having influence, a positive influence in that realm.
Yeah, so this has always kind of bedeviled me, this question, because it seems to me, particularly if we think about small c conservative politicians who, when they're campaigning, use religion a lot. you know? And it's confusing to me that once they are there, then it becomes harder to find those values, in my opinion. So I guess I would say to you, I think we need to call each other on that. I think politicians need to be called on their value system. It doesn't have to be about their membership in a particular faith, but I think we say things as politicians that echo the value system of Christianity or Judaism or Islam about all people and inclusion. We need to have that thrown back at us. We need to be confronted with that. And that's kind of what I say to ISARC, hold us to account. And I think that needs to happen at all levels. And it happened to me. My minister at the time when we put $810 million into developmental services, we were in a pitched battle with our finance minister,
no doubt,
as you always are with finance ministers. And my minister at the time basically gave me an ultimatum. He said, you do this or I can't be part of what we're about. So, he was calling me. He was calling me on my belief system and my values, and that wasn't the whole reason, but it was a piece of why I was able to then stand up to our finance minister and say this has to happen. So I think that we need to be much braver as people who, not as members of a religious sect or a religious, even a denomination, but as people who believe in all the things that politicians say they believe in when they're running for office. I think we need to be not afraid. You need to be not afraid to go and have those conversations with politicians. So I would encourage you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hello.
Hi.
My name is also Kathleen.
Can I disclose our connection, Kathleen?
Yes.
So Kathleen's uncle was that chief of staff that I was talking about, who was with me in the Ministry of Education. So
yeah.
Yeah.
So I come from a family that engages in the discussion of what place faith has in politics a lot. But I find I struggle sometimes taking that conversation outside of a place where that's welcome, or when you face that resistance to the idea that faith has a place in the discussions of politics. And so my question is, how do we engage in those conversations when they aren't very welcome or when there's resistance to that without becoming too discouraged?
It's a great question, and I think it's a great question that for young people to be asking. And my advice, and this may sound a little cynical, so I just bear with me, but my advice would be, don't start at the religion part. Start at how do we think things should go? What do we think the right thing to do is in this situation? How would you like to see this resolved? Posing the problem. So if we use the challenge of homelessness, for example. I mean, what's the problem here? How can we best solve it? How do we have a conversation with people who have some solutions to this? And then, if it is a conversation that is going to go anywhere in terms of you making the connection, I think it's a legitimate question just to ask people, well, where does that value system come from? Because if we're going to solve the problem, we have to figure out what values we're using, and then where do those values come from? The reason I wanted my children to go to church was I wanted them to have a base from which to understand my moral code, how I sorted out right from wrong, and then they could figure it out for themselves. It didn't matter to me whether they went to a different church or no church, whatever, but I wanted them to be rooted in some sense of how a moral code gets developed. So I think you can come at the conversation that way. You may end up in a faith and social justice conversation, or you may not get to the religion part, but at least you can have the values-based conversation, which is really where we need to all be.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, Kathleen.
Hi.
Hi. I'm an undergraduate student here at Laurier, and I'm actually taking John Malloy's GC class, second-year Canadian Questions class. And we're actually touching upon a topic about the Basic Income Pilot Project.
Right.
And it's been about almost a year since the program fully wrapped up. And I actually want to know, through your perspective, what was the biggest impact that it had on you, and from then until now?
Well, first of all, you mean the cancellation, or?
The cancellation.
Well, it was painful. It was a painful moment because we didn't see it coming. Mm-hmm. I knew that the current premier wanted to undo the things that we had done, and he went in and canceled the cap and trade program and shut down the writing of Indigenous curriculum and, a whole bunch of things. But he had said during the campaign that he would not cancel the basic income pilot, and we would actually be able to get the evidence from that pilot. So it pains me that we weren't able to do that evaluation. But what I think has happened in that year and a half since it was canceled is that there's a pretty clear understanding among policymakers and I would say a lot of the general public that it was working, that there were people who were really seeing their lives changed, that there is evidence there that we should go back to or we should look at. There's a basic income network that has developed around the province, I hope across the country. There are other provinces that are looking at the possibility of setting up a pilot. So I think it was important that we moved the bar. We by setting up the basic income pilot, it was obvious that it was possible to do it and that there were potentially good outcomes because we saw people getting work and keeping work. We saw people being able to go back to school and stay in school, and those were the kinds of outcomes that we were hoping for. What really pains me is that without all the evidence and without the sort of proper evaluation, we weren't able to take that pilot and apply it to the changes in the social assistance program that need to happen. We never were proposing that, the basic income pilot as it was designed would be the model for the province. What we wanted to do was take the learnings and apply them to the reform of the social assistance. So I think that it will be much more possible for a progressive government when one is reelected to pick up where we left off and take some of those learnings and either launch another pilot or actually start to make some changes. That's the takeaway for me.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good morning. It's still morning.
Good morning.
Thank you very much. My name is Florence Juma. I work here part-time as associate professional faculty. I also work out in the community. And it's been very eye-opening. Sometimes we look at politicians, and unless we had a previous knowledge of their context, we may not be able to see a holistic picture. Mm-hmm. Because sometimes we look from the perspective of what is our needs at the time, and in most cases, those needs are either not or slightly met, and probably puts us in a position where we find ourselves in the camps of them and us. I was impressed by the comment that government, in your perspective, is a magnet where we serve each other or do things for each other. My question, and most of how I'm going to frame it, has been addressed one way or another, and I was debating whether I should even come. But there is an aspect that is still left that would help to hear from you from the perspective of potential aspiring politicians and the younger generation of those who may come to the public place or may find themselves engaged in the government or in public life, serving in the public domain. As you look back, what you knew then and what drove you into politics and how it played out during your tenure, are there lessons that you may say, opportunities, or should you have known what you know today going into leadership and in public life? What would you do different, or what would you tell those who are coming? Lessons that they don't have to repeat history. There are things that could have been done different, or impact that would have given the opportunities and resources that you ended up seeing are available. How can people learn or pick up and not fall into the same pitfalls, but build to a better and even stronger public life and service?
That's a big question. I always think that politics is a bit like childbirth, is you can know a lot about it, but you actually can't know everything about it. And that's probably a good thing. Sorry if I make people uncomfortable, but anyway. See, that's what happens when you put a woman at the front of the stage. So I don't really know how to answer your question, because everybody's path is different. What I would say to myself, if I were to look back at myself at 40, I would say just be a bit braver, because I think if I had been a bit braver, and if I had spoken my mind a bit more clearly at various junctures, I might have found my way more quickly, or I might have been able to do some more good earlier on. I think I hesitated. And this is a conversation that actually bleeds into the women in politics conversation, which is you have to ask women 3, 4, 5 times to run for office. You don't have to ask most men 3, 4, 5 times to run for office. They feel fully qualified. And again, that's a generalization, and I don't mean to denigrate any individual, but I think that as women, I would suggest that we need to support one another in speaking up. We need more women at the table. There's now one woman who's a premier of a province. She's a premier of Northwest Territories in this country. Women are still underrepresented in these decision-making conversations. And so I would say, if I look back on my career, I would look for ways to support more women and to find environments where I would be empowered to have conversations that maybe I didn't have because I held back. So that is one thing that I think I would change. But I would say that for the most part, I tried in my political career not to have regrets, which is why I ran for the leadership of the party, that I was never the odds-on favorite to win. Not when I ran in 2003 because I was running against a cabinet minister, not in 2007 because John Tory, the leader of the Conservatives, was running against me, not for the leadership. And so it was really important, and this is a lesson as opposed to something I would do differently, it's really important to know that losing is not the worst thing that can happen to you in politics. Not taking part can be the worst thing. That's where the regret can come in. And so I would just encourage people who want to step into that public realm to take a chance, because it is very, very worth it.
Thank you.
Okay. I think there's one. Is there one more? I think there's one more, John. Is that okay? We good? Okay. And then I think we have to be done. They're fidgeting here, so
okay,
I think that means...
I think this will be pretty
quick.
The
fidget here, yes.
Thank you very much for coming. I'm faculty at Laurier. My name is Ashley Lebner, and I just have a quick question, and I have some of my students here too. So I'm just wondering if you could clarify or give us some more examples about your experience of when religion, as you say, has been used as a partisan tool. So some maybe more kind of concrete examples of that moment. And also, although I'm sympathetic to this conversation, I work in the Department of Religion and Culture. I mean, it's obviously very important to understand religious perspectives today. But I wonder to what extent kind of advocating for religion in public life actually can avoid becoming a partisan tool, right? So if you're saying that we should be open to this kind of conversation, how is one kind of faith in public life okay, whereas using it as a partisan tool might not be okay? So I'm just wondering if you could clarify that.
Okay. So when I say being open about our moral code and our value system, which is rooted for me in a Christian faith, in a particular denomination, I mean, that's not the part of the conversation that would come up in my public persona. You know, I mean, the only reason I'm having this conversation is because that's the subject here. But if I am talking in a forum about basic income, I'm not talking about my upbringing in the United Church. But that's where it's rooted, right? So, and I'm not afraid to talk about that if I'm asked about it. In terms of the partisan tool, I think the oversimplification and the misrepresentation of what a faith says or what the religious dogma is, or, you know, I think, or isolating on either side, you know, whether we're talking about a progressive or a regressive position, I think it does us all a disservice. And so whether we talk about the sex ed curriculum, I mean, homophobia in this province has been a hammer of the far-right Christian movement and the extreme Muslim and Judah. You know, I mean, those are the people who were attacking me when I went to Mississauga and I was standing in a crowd of hostile people. They were there as people of faith, arguing that I was evil. I mean, that's what it was. So that example, I think that the issues around same-sex marriage and the discussion in the federal election, I think religion was used as a hammer against Andrew Scheer. Now, you know, regardless of my political stripe, I think that was a problem. And I think it boxed him into a corner where he actually couldn't get out of. So I think those are the most recent examples in this country, and I think we have to beware of them going forward.
Thank you. That's it.
You're welcome.
I told you it was short.
And Ken is invoking senior privilege. Yes, Mr. Chair.
I did have a reputation around town of being very brief when I made my comments. I do want to make a very brief observation, and that is to the audience here that the person you heard this morning is the person who was the Premier of Ontario and did exactly what she said today. And for that, I want to say thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you.
I think that was a good way to wrap up the questions. I'd like to call on another very special guest we have with us this morning, Bishop Michael Price, the Bishop of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Canada, the Eastern Synod, who's graced us here with his presence to thank our speaker. Bishop?
Do you want me to sit down? Is it awkward, or you want me to stand with my arm around you? I'll sit down.
I smiled, Ms. Wynne, when you said that people like you and John get invited everywhere. These folks go to church a whole lot more than most of us would ever want to go to church. And I had the pleasure of breaking pula, breaking bread, with Ms. Wynne on a number of occasions when in her work as MPP, she visited Agricola Lutheran Church, Finnish Lutheran Church in Toronto. The congregants, of course, were always pleased to have their political leaders with them. I was always impressed with Ms. Wynne's remarks, where she lifted up and pointed a light on the importance of faith and the importance of faith communities and participating in activities for the sake of the common good. I was also, as David mentioned, very moved when you joined us in 2015 on that walk from Hull to Ottawa. You were, of course, there for the survivors and their families, but you made a point of connecting with those of us that were there representing faith communities and organizations to thank us for our presence and to encourage us in our work. Just a few notes that I took today. I was heartened and very encouraged to hear you say that for you, faith and politics have been relatively seamless in how you have lived your life, and that you've tried to live out of the principles that were transmitted to you by a community of faith. I was grateful that you also said that that was not shaken in the midst of the vile hatred that was directed to you by people that claimed to be speaking from a faith perspective. And I, as a faith leader, and I hope all of us, as people who at least have some interest in the life of faith, will do everything that we can to speak out and call out those voices which do great harm to the social fabric, great harm to human beings, great harm to all of us as people of faith. We can't let this stand. You rightly called out the use of religion as a partisan hammer. And all of us, regardless of our political perspectives, need to hear that word from you. And I heard it loud and clear today, Madam Premier. Thank you, Ms. Wynne, for your distinguished record of service and leadership to the people of Ontario. Thank you for taking faith, and thank you for taking people of faith seriously. Thank you for blessing us, and it was a blessing, with your presence and with your inspiring and challenging remarks today. All of us are truly grateful. Thank you.
Doesn't the bishop do a great job thanking people? I said he should do this for a living. Thank you, Bishop. I want to echo just a few words of wrap up. Obviously, echo my personal thanks, Kathleen, for your talk here today, for your presence at Laurier and your friendship. It's been wonderful having you here. I want to thank all of you for coming out here today. As I noted, we've been in the process of recording today. It will be edited and be available on our website for your use, and I know many of you are involved with students and classes and things, so it'll be available there. It's been a great morning. Thank you for coming out. In closing, I know it's traditional to present a gift to a speaker, and in this case, knowing a little bit about Kathleen and her interests, in lieu of a gift, we've decided to make a donation to the Glebe Center, and in particular the Walking With You Fund, which is a fund for refugees who are acclimatizing themselves to life here in Canada and needing that extra support. So we'll be making a donation in your name for it. So once again, thank you all for coming out here this morning. It's been a wonderful day. Keep your eyes open for future events here at Martin Luther University College, and have a great rest of the day and weekend. Thank you. You've been listening to a talk by Ontario's 25th Premier, Kathleen Wynne, on faith in public life, recorded at Martin Luther University College in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. For more about Luther and its Centre for Public Ethics, please check out our website at PublicEthics.ca.